Shalom to everyone. Hello, everyone. Wow, we have a big audience today. My name is Dina Wachtel, and on behalf of myself and my co-host, Ayala Davis, and all our colleagues here at Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, we want to welcome you all to this program today from all across the country. And also thank the many of you that submitted your questions in advance. Due to the number of questions we already received, there likely won't be an opportunity to take more questions live. Now, I am honored to introduce Norman Bacal to kick off our program and thank him for helping to make this evening possible. In a career that has spanned 4 decades, Norm had made his mark as an authority on international tax structures as one of Canada's leading film finance lawyers. Recognized for his tireless volunteer work, championing many causes, he is also a successful author, penning the bestseller Breakdown, that documents the rise and fall of Heenan Blaikie, the firm he ran for 16 years. He's now finalizing 2 more books. Most importantly, Norm is married to Sharon, and they are the proud parents of 4 children and 5 grandchildren. Norm brings a unique perspective to this audience on the background of our interviewer and our guest this evening. Norm, please take it away.
Tina, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Tonight I have a very unique opportunity to introduce to all of you 2 people who I've known for a very long time. When I first met our host interviewer, Monette Malewski, who is known, I think, probably to all of us just as Monette. It was well over 3 decades ago. She was an educator. She was involved in community service. And I believed at that point I had a small inkling that she might become part of my family and I hers. But the one thing I don't think either of us could have predicted was that she would go on to become a very successful business person and an icon as a community leader. That's why I use the name Monette, because I think in the province of Quebec, just hearing the name Monette rings a bell to everyone in the public sector. They know exactly who you're talking about. As for our guest of honor and interviewee tonight, Calin Rovinescu, Calin and I met over 4 decades ago as, in the words of Gilbert and Sullivan, impecunious law students. We were both just married. We were both very eager to get started in the practice of law. He at a firm called Stikeman Elliott, and myself at a firm that was a spin-off of Stikeman Elliott. And I believe at that point, the brass ring we were both after was a successful legal career and inevitably partnership in our firms. At that point in time, the name Air Canada represented pretty much an arm of the federal government. And I think when we thought about it, that's all we thought of, Air Canada, the Crown Corporation. But I think if you would have asked me at that point in time whether I could ever have imagined that Calin would go on to not only become the successful lawyer that he did and attain the partnership goal that he had, but that he would go on from there and open up its London office, spend 5 years there, come back and become the leader of its flagship office in Montreal, I would have expressed a little bit of surprise. If you would have told me that after that, he'd go on to become the chief restructuring officer of the greatest Canadian airline disaster in Canadian history, which at that point was Air Canada, in the wake of its economic collapse, and that from there he would go on to spend 5 years as an investment banker, I would have scratched my head. If you would have told me after that that he'd go back to Air Canada to take on the role of its chief executive officer, I would have told you you were insane. And I also probably would have told Calin he had to be insane to go back there. Yet he did. So both our host and our interviewee have had remarkable careers that could never have been predicted. And I sat back and I scratched my head and I said, they followed such completely different paths, yet there must be some degree of commonality between them. And after a little bit of thought, I remember back to the day I started my son after we moved to Toronto in karate. And I walked into the dojo, and I was completely unsuited for karate, but because he was starting, I started. And as I walked in, the first thing I noticed was a tiny little sign on the outside of the dojo. And it said, regardless of the number of years of practice, one can never advance without single-minded determination. And I think if there's one thing that defines both Monette and Calin, it is that single-minded determination that have taken them from where they began to places where they could never possibly have imagined, and made the two of them really iconic in that regard. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Monette. And my challenge for all of you who are listening tonight is to listen to them carefully and ask yourselves whether you, from your own experience, see other possible commonalities and other ways in which they are not only linked to themselves, but possibly to each of you.
Wow. Norman, what can I say? That was incredible. And I knew you would rise to the cause, and you could do the whole program and you'd be great. And you could tell all of us a lot of things. So I really thank you so much. And I think, Calin, it's the same. We appreciate so much you being here and you being able to introduce both of us. And so for the audience, Dina told you that we're not going to ask you to ask any questions, because I've tried to put the questions into some of the thought process. And this interview will be a little different because it's not going to be a back and forth between Calin and myself. We together agreed on about 5 themes that we were going to broach. And I was going to start the conversation and Calin was going to delve into all of them. And any questions that have been sent in, I've tried to integrate them into some of the themes. So the first theme we're going to start with is perfect for what Norman just said. And it's really about a personal story and values. So Norman, you're right. We do meet in certain places, but one place in common that both Calin and I have is we have similar backgrounds. We are both children of Holocaust survivors. Mine from Belgium and Calin from Romania. And we came to Canada, both of us, at a very early age with little in ways of means. And we were very fortunate to see our country and indeed the world progress, innovate, and transfer dramatically. In many of your speeches, Calin, and messages, you refer often to 3 words that hold true to you and your values. And those 3 words I noticed are knowledge, courage, and mindfulness. Now, both you and I have had the privilege of going to the HUJI and looking at the archives of Einstein, because for those in the audience who don't know, in 1955, when Einstein died, he left his entire intellectual property to the Hebrew University, and it's sitting in archives. And I know that Calin's told me, and I've been thrilled to go see them. But Einstein once said, "Have the courage to take your thoughts seriously, for they will shape you." So Calin, can you expand on why and how your upbringing and those 3 words that you use so often have helped shape you?
Thank you, Monette, and it is a pleasure to be here. And obviously, Norm, thank you very much for those kind words. I was adding the 70 years that you've collectively known Monette and myself together, and it is actually pretty funny that we all find ourselves here on this webcast. So, I'll start like this, Monette. When my parents came to Canada, they had a grand total of $50 and some suitcases, 3 suitcases. But what they had, and this is the one thing that was, ingrained in myself and my sister kind of forever, is they both had amazing higher educations. And so from that moment forward, it was, this wealth of accumulated higher education knowledge would kind of set them free and indirectly set us free. So we came with absolutely nothing. That was the sum total of our worldly possessions, was that $50. And that kind of translated into kind of many other chapters and many other opportunities, many other things that we've all done here. So whenever I've gotten involved with universities, with some of you may know that I'm the Chancellor at the University of Ottawa, so I'm highly committed to higher education. Been also very involved with scholarships at the University of Montreal and elsewhere. And a big part of the asset pool that I really believe in is that. Once you have that higher education as well, of course, the brain is a muscle to be exercised. The brain cannot be left stagnant. One of the things that right now, as we're going through this unbearable crisis, and of course we'll talk about that in a few minutes, the exercise that the brain gets and the stimulation that it has, I view it as equivalent to exercising any other muscle, any other outdoor activity that people get, is that stimulation of that brain is the number one thing that drives me. Courage, we talk knowledge, courage, mindfulness, and you do pick up those words, and I get teased by my kids that I have used those words on a few occasions. We often wonder, what are the most relevant human qualities? What are the things that are the most important? You can talk about kindness, you can talk about empathy, you can talk about lots and lots of qualities. But this actually comes right from Aristotle. In fact, courage is the one that defines them, because without courage, a lot of the others would not be achievable. And so when we talk about courage, it goes to the courage in many cases to make a tough decision, the courage to stay, the courage to leave if you're in a relationship environment, if you're in a job that doesn't suit you, if you're sometimes it takes enormous amounts of courage to face the morning. It takes courage to combat depression. It takes courage in so many different forms, and sadly a lot of people lack courage, and often that goes to people that are in positions of elected authority to make tough decisions for the fear of not being popular, etc., etc. And certainly in my business dealings, I would say that if there's one speech that I give to a lot of our managers, it's the execution of strategies that are based on authenticity and courage, whether they are popular or not. And mindfulness, of course, and those that are familiar with some of the Buddhist thought, will know that mindfulness is one of these great qualities that gives you a heightened sense of awareness, an ability to sort of hear when others are not speaking, to sort of see around corners, to anticipate. And that kind of mindfulness, when you're really paying attention, you kind of get to almost read people's minds. You sort of can anticipate things before they come. In a business context, that actually serves you quite well as you plan strategy. In a personal context, relationship-wise, it serves you well as you navigate through how other people are viewing you and what you're seeing. And often, this kind of breakdown of communication often comes as a result of a lack of true understanding. And so this is one of those dynamics where we take some sort of touchy-feely concepts, knowledge, courage, mindfulness, and you can apply it to almost any relationship, any business, any dynamic, and it actually works pretty quite well, I would say, and it's been something that I have been teased about for using, but something that I verily believe in.
No, that's great, because Norman's sister and my sister and my daughter, stepdaughter, very much is living in Kulu, and mindfulness is definitely everything that she tells us to keep doing. So we sometimes do it, right, Norman? So we appreciate what you're telling us. We also know that self-care is also very important, so especially now. So what do you do to take care of yourself physically and mentally so that you could be fully present and be mindful?
The one thing that as I've gone through these various challenges, the number one driver is actually staying fit and staying healthy, and like that is often taken for granted. People talk about the fact that they've I've worked countless hours and I'm up all night, so on. Especially young professionals often do that, and they compromise their health, so on and so forth. The perspective of having a balanced and healthy lifestyle, which involves, as it does for many people on this call, involves sport, involves some form of stimulation outside of what you're doing on a daily basis, is so critical. And so for me, it's been continuing to have that same curiosity about all matters, finding ways to exercise outside, finding ways to engage with as many people as I can, despite this current social distancing dynamic. And I'd say that, the human contact, of course, we all miss it enormously. We miss it enormously. And as soon as some of the rules were dropped, that is something that, I engaged in right away. I mean, it's human nature, and we cannot deny it. And we have to force ourselves into that dynamic, because it's too easy to fall into these traps of solitary confinement and sort of feeling sorry for oneself. And so I'd say that the balance of exercise, health, stimulation for the brain, again, this intellectual curiosity, I have to tell you that whether it's humor, we've all, in the early days of this pandemic, many people were sharing jokes online. Humor is a big driver. I shared with, including with many, with many former colleagues and so on. That's a way for us to have kept in touch. And the other dynamic that has in a way intrigued me throughout this is that a lot of the very senior CEOs in this country, people that you would not think would have the gumption or the interest to reach out, because the worlds that we collectively have been living in are sort of relatively speaking hectic, theoretically ivory towers. But I can tell you that group of people, including some of the most senior people in the country, they actually reached out to have phone calls. And that human interaction has been a key ingredient for this, right up and down the chain of humanity, I would say.
Yeah, and where I would agree with you is that during Corona, unfortunately, I think as humans, we feel first and think later. And during Corona, we had to think first and feel after. And it's so different to who we are. So when reaching out, it's really about that feeling, that human connectivity. And that feeling then gives you the ability to do the thinking and the mindfulness that you're talking about. So
exactly.
And so it was really the opposite that was happening for 3 months. And that's really difficult. Thank you so much. So the next thing we're going to go on is something that Norman really hit upon very well. And it's your leadership skills and the leadership in times of crisis while moving Air Canada to top of class. So as Norman said, you became CEO of Air Canada in 2009, but that was in the aftermath of the 2008 collapse of the financial markets. And you have been credited with having really saved Air Canada from bankruptcy and having set it on a course of sustainable profitability, better labor relations, and continued success in the last 11 years. Your shares even appreciated by approximately 4,000%. And the airlines achieved record revenues, record profitability, and carried a record number of passengers. It also expanded dramatically, and until COVID-19, served in all 6 continents. Air Canada has been recognized by Skytrax as the best airline in North America in 7 out of 9 years. It has won numerous awards and was considered one of Canada's top employers in 2018. But there have been many crises in 19 years that have affected the airlines. The first one, you weren't there, but 9/11 in 2001, financial meltdown in 2008, the SARS in 2012, and now COVID. So what skills are the most important that you need to lead through the times of crisis, and how does that differ from other times?
So first of all, I would correct you on one thing. I was indeed there on 9/11.
Oh yes, you were in England.
I was, yeah. I was at Air Canada. I was at
Air Canada. Okay, I thought 2004. My mistake.
Yeah. No, in an executive role. But and that's actually important because it goes to the relative crisis dynamic that the industry is facing here. And I think this is obviously an interesting topic to unpack a little bit. First of all, I'd start by saying that the most dynamic way of effecting change is when you have a burning platform. And this kind of a burning platform, one of two things happens. You either burn to the ground on the burning platform, or you actually use it, build a lifeline, have a live to fight another day and have another opportunity to grow and to rebuild. And in that latter case, of course, then you see whether or not you've actually built a foundation that is strong enough for the future. So The burning platform that you've described a few of them here. This is a very, very, very complicated industry, right? As I've said on several occasions, in other contexts, when we look at the number of factors that you have going against you in this environment, you're dealing with a extremely high capital cost situation, in the airline space, because of the fact that you're buying, airplanes that today, wide body airplanes cost $125, $150 million per aircraft, these, 787s and that style of aircraft. The cost of labor is extremely high. It's a high labor intensive sort of a business. So high capital cost, high labor intensive. You can't get the costs out overnight when you have a disaster. And you have a tremendous amount of dependence on outside factors, such as, of course, regulatory interventions. The events of 9/11, that kind of a terrorist attack was a terrorist attack against, obviously against the United States, but using tools that our industry. So they used the weapons of mass destruction that were used in 9/11 were airplanes, right? When we look at the SARS pandemic, of course, the first industry that was affected, because the SARS crisis was in Hong Kong and Toronto primarily, but the airline industry. When we look at regulatory outcomes, it tends to be in our space. And then, of course, this current dynamic brought the industry completely to its knees, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So when you look at these kinds of I would say existential crises, there are, I'd say, half a dozen drivers that I've learned from having been involved in each and every one of them. 9/11, I wasn't, of course, CEO, but I was a senior officer at Air Canada with my ex-colleague Robert Milton running the company. And I'd say the number one thing that when we've learned through all this is to have a clear communication path. That type of dynamic, it sounds basic, but often, you've got complicated strategies as to how you're getting out from under any one of these dynamics. And you may have the brightest idea, you may be the smartest person in the room, but you can't actually get 38,000 people in our case, to be moving in the same direction unless you're capable of communicating with them. So when I look through all of these various years and all these various challenges, number one is this dynamic around communication. Secondly, a lot of decision makers, be they political decision makers or business decision makers, have fallen into this trap of what we call analysis paralysis, that they analyze, they've got committees, they've got debates, and the thing goes on and on and on and on and on and on, and you actually, it takes way too long to make decisions. Mm-hmm. And so we adopted early on in these crises a just do it mindset. You might make a wrong decision, but you're going to make a decision. And I think that has been one of the things that has sort of distinguished what we've been doing both now and what happened in 2009, is that the idea that we're not going to take forever to make our decisions. It's not going to be a pleasant dynamic for everyone, because in many of these tough situations, you are not going to be capable of making everybody happy. So moving quickly, making decisions in a way that doesn't involve paralysis of decision making, communicating it. Third thing I would say is the capability to manage stakeholders. I would say transparently, even when there's bad news involved. And complicated businesses have got multiple stakeholders. So you've got labor stakeholders, you've got meaning your labor unions, you've got employees, you have, in our case, shareholders as a publicly traded company, you've got government stakeholders, customer stakeholders, supplier stakeholders, lessor stakeholders, and this goes on and on. And I think that when something is a transformational sort of event, we always applied the theory of the Rubik's Cube, that we need to be working all sides of the cube at the same time. We can't wait to fix one group of stakeholders before dealing with the other group of stakeholders. And so, this has been something that, it's sort of, if you were able to keep that Rubik's Cube moving, and you keep it moving at a fairly, rapid pace, because you're making decisions quickly and you're communicating what it is that you're doing. First of all, it's tough for people to keep up with you. but you're actually moving the needle while this is going on. You're not staying stagnant. You cannot remain stagnant in those contexts, and that is one of the things I think that I've been very pleased with in the past, and again in this current context, I think we're using a lot of those sort of simple lessons.
Mm-hmm. So during this crisis, which obviously was different than a lot of others, what was the most difficult day and why?
I mean, far and away, the most difficult day, and I've discussed it with my wife Elaine on many occasions, was this, after this amazing decade of success, and frankly, that 4,000%, I would modestly say, actually understates the stock market performance.
Was it 5% when you start, $5 when you started? And
no, it was 78 cents.
78 cents, okay.
78
and then
cents.
in 2019, December, it was $50. Yeah,
$50.
exactly.
So I think the Wikipedia was a little bit out of date, but the point being that, but that was just one aspect, and frankly, that was not the thing that made me the proudest. The thing that made me the proudest is what we did with our people. This was a people story. This was a people story where we kind of hired 10,000 incremental. We created 10,000 incremental jobs over the last 4.5, 5 years. We went from a company that was doing about $8.5 billion of revenue to a company doing $20 billion of revenue over that period of time. We were a mature company. I often use the expression that Air Canada had become an 80-year-old startup. We had a startup culture. And so here we have this amazing, group of people that have built this fantastic, engine of success, creating 10,000 jobs. And then, within a period of 3.5 weeks, we see the dismantlement of something like this, right? So, right now, it wasn't just that the demand had dried up, but of course, the way governments responded to it, the combination, I know we'll talk about this afterwards, the combination of quarantine, travel restrictions, border restrictions, travel advisories, of course, bringing the industry completely to its knees, which led to massive layoffs. And we had the saddest day by far of my entire professional career was having to decide that we were going to implement 20,000 layoffs and 20,000 families affected through this. And these are catastrophic sorts of outcomes. But the part that I found extremely, I would say, in light within this amount of darkness was the fact that I had received a tremendous number of letters, communications from hundreds of employees, several hundred, including some who had been laid off, and sort of with enormous appreciation for what we had built as a culture, and sort of looking forward for the day when they'd be able to come back. So this is, this is probably the number one thing, and not only during this process, but I would say in my entire career, that seeing after everything that we did, within 3.5 weeks, the dismantlement of that is actually pretty breathtaking. Now, many other companies have suffered also loss. Some companies are not coming back. We've seen multiple bankruptcies. Air Canada, fortunately, because of what we did over the decade, was in a healthier spot. I know you want to talk about that as well after, but basically, despite that, this was a very, very, very sad day for me, and one that I will always remember.
So how do you, knowing that and knowing you will come back, and maybe faster or later, hopefully by your standards faster, so how do you balance the considerations of those that you lost and they're such difficult assets? How do you balance that consideration?
Right. Well, I mean, look, the number one thing that we concluded that we had to do, and this goes back to what I said before, in terms of acting with dispatch, acting with speed, and acting with certainty. Making a decision doesn't mean you're always going to make the right decision, but you're going to make a decision. So we decided that our number one objective was to save the company, save the enterprise. We also decided that we could not rely on anyone else to help us. We could not rely on government. We didn't know whether or not we would be able to rely on government. And despite that, governments around the world have chosen to support the airline industries in their countries, the government of Canada has, in its wisdom, decided not to. So we could not count on that. So therefore, we had to do what we needed to do ourselves. Our business was down 97%, right? down 97%. I know that people who've had some catastrophic reductions in their business, down 10%, 15%, 20%, 25%, 50%. Obviously, some restaurants were completely closed and shut, and they were down 100%, but they're kind of back up. We were down 97%, and it's coming back slowly. And we'll talk a little bit about the impediments for it to come back more strongly. So when we looked at that picture, we said, we need to be in control of what it is that we do. And again, that's another lesson that I draw from all of this, is that whatever tools that you have at your disposal that are within your control, and recognizing that in the airline space, a lot is not within our control, but whatever is within our control, exploit and use. And so we raised tremendous amounts of liquidity. We've already raised more than $4 billion in the less than 90 days, $4 billion. Our objective was one of survival, to be able to wait this out if we had to go into a state of hibernation for the airline. Effectively, when you're operating at 3%, we didn't lay off 97% of our workforce, but we laid off 50% of our workforce.
Sure.
And go into this state of hibernation, or state of induced coma is another expression that is often used, is to we put the company continuing to operate, but airplanes grounded, people not at work, and so on and so forth. Remembering, of course, that there are human beings behind each one of these jobs, the jobs that stay and the jobs that go. So there is a talent loss, there is a talent drain, but again, the objective being to live to fight another day, and doing the things that are essential and critical to ensure that the company comes out of this stronger. Air Canada, because of what we've done in particular over the decade, Air Canada I view as a living, breathing entity. It has a soul. It has a capability to produce. It has a capability to nurture. It has a capability to make people happy. And my objective is to have that living, breathing entity continue to thrive when all this is over. And that is the number one objective. And therefore, while there will be some disappointments and some people who are happier than others, it was sort of my objective that that would be the outcome here. And we're still, let's face it, we're not, this is, the pandemic, while we may have flattened the curve to a degree in Canada, certainly I would not say that collectively we're out of the woods here. And as we know, until there's a vaccine, it's going to be a challenging time for many businesses.
For sure. And during this time, we're looking at the stock market, and certainly the TSA has soared, from the beginning of the pandemic to today. And the Air Canada stocks are largely been range bound, as they would say. So the markets state that you're in a much better position, and you just stated yourself, to many global airlines themselves. So at the same time, Warren Buffett gave up the airlines as part of his portfolio in the last quarter. So can you explain why the markets consider you in such a big place compared to others? And also if Warren Buffett's decision has any impact on you, if any.
So, okay, thanks, Monette. So two things. One, airlines have, as I mentioned earlier, these enormous number of extraneous challenges that come to it. And so as soon as this pandemic hit and the economic impact, the financial impact was starting to be felt, I think that the world at large started identifying survivors. And survivors were identified largely on the basis of their, say their management capability, but also based on their balance sheets and what it is that they brought into the pandemic. And again, we came into this with a very, very strong balance sheet, right. Because we had sort of prudent fiscal management. We had, we were not buying back large amounts of shares the way some of the US carriers were. We were prudent with how much cash we were carrying. And so we actually had a very, very sort of prudent approach to this. We wanted to achieve investment grade credit rating. So we came at this with $7 billion of liquidity, which is a large amount for an airline our size. Many of the US carriers had nowhere near that relative to their size, nor did the European carriers. I'm talking about the largest carriers in the world, like the Deltas, Americans, United, Southwest, British Airways, Air France, KLM, Lufthansa. So we had a much better balance sheet relative to our size. They all got so-called bailouts or support from their governments. We didn't. And our objective for the time being is still to
I think they got 25 billion or something like that.
yeah, the US got 25 billion grant and 25 billion loan. So it's actually 50 billion US, 50 billion US, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, you know, the last time I looked is 80 billion Canadian.
Right.
So no, large amounts of money, and you know, we could be envious and we could be jealous, but actually, again, we put our heads down and said we're going to keep going. And so I think the market very, very quickly understood that and gave us the benefit of the doubt, and then, you know, saw subsequent that we were, as I mentioned, able to raise an additional 4 billion. Now we're burning tremendous amounts of cash. I mean, we're burning, you know, $22 million a day. This is in the public domain, which is, you know, and this is after all sorts of mitigation and cost transformations and after the layoffs and all that. So it's you know, multiplied by 30 days, you know, even without being Einstein, and see one can do the math. So you know, we're looking at $600 million plus a month of cash burn. And that's a, you know, ridiculous amount. And that's why we're very, very anxious to get back and start doing some increased business. So the markets, you know, we suffered like the rest of the industry. Our stock price is down, certainly in relation to what we had at the beginning of the year because of all this.
I think today it was $19.
$19, and we were, you know, we traded as high as $50 at the beginning of the year. But as I say, we managed to raise a lot of liquidity, and you know, markets are generally positive, and you know, analysts have us at you know, north of $30 within the year and so on. So therefore, sort of the assumption being that we're going to be able to power through this. In terms of Warren Buffett, you know, Warren Buffett is obviously an amazing investor, you know, extremely brilliant investor overall. I think that, you know, his expectation when he invested in the U.S. airlines, he invested, as I think you probably know, in all of the big four U.S. airlines. And his expectation is that the problems of the industry are behind the industry. And that is true. The problems of the industry, which were a combination of sort of irresponsible capacity dumping in some markets, you know, sort of buying back your shares and this sort of thing. Largely, there was tremendous amount of good disciplined behavior on the part of the U.S. carriers, but then they got caught with this. You know, so you talk about the ultimate black swan event for the industry. This is the ultimate black swan event for the industry. So I think he basically is saying the level of volatility involved in this, and you've seen it on a daily basis. You know, the stock market variations for airlines. You know, it's not unusual for it to go between 8 and 16% in a given day down, and 8 to 16% up. You know, so that's not the kind of investor that he has been. I think he's a long-term patient investor. His view is that this industry is going to be challenged for the next few years, which I don't disagree with. I mean, I've said it again publicly that I think that getting back to 2019 levels of performance is that you're looking at least 3 years from now. So, you know, this is if you go back to the beginning of this pandemic, a 3.5 year minimum rebuild to get to 2019 levels. So I think he decided there's better uses of his cash over that period. It doesn't really have much of an impact on us. He was not an investor in our company, but certainly when he exited the stock, that had an impact on all of the airlines, and took all the airlines down to a lower level, and sort of then it went up from that level. It increased back up, but I don't know if it went above the price it was when he sold it. I have not looked at that.
So talking about that, and what you just said about, so what does the business model find a new path for profitability? So how do you see that?
You know, there are going to be, I divide that into two chapters. One is the chapter between now and the time we have a vaccine, and then after we have a vaccine. And I think between now and the time we have a vaccine, it is going to be clumsy and in fits and starts for two reasons. One, I think there is a chance and maybe even a likelihood of a second wave that the economy and certainly our industry is going to have to deal with. And you know, there'll be you know, more complicated processes from a biosecurity perspective at airports, measures being taken on board the airplane, and we've done a tremendous number of things to advance that.
We'll talk about that soon. Mm-hmm.
Right. So that means that, you know, demand will be challenged for the next few years until there's a vaccine. Post-vaccine, I think that there will be some permanent changes that will have occurred in aviation. You know, because I think people will be, to some degree, afraid of being caught on the other end of the universe if they don't have the means to get back on their own and figure out how it is that they're going to get back. We did see, that there were pockets of the globe where people were stuck for a long time, like in Peru.
Yeah, Peru was one of them, if you remember.
Yeah,
Well.
Peru was a complicated one because Peru was, basically there was a total lockdown. The airports were closed. We ended up operating some rescue flights into Peru and had to operate out of a military airport with military patrols, outdoor facilities, very, 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 very basic and rudimentary kind of an outcome there. And so if someone who went through that and may have been stuck there for 60 days or 45 days and being afraid for their lives and so on, I doubt that those sorts of adventure trips are going to be that prevalent. But look, at the end of the day, and we're even seeing pockets of it right now, people like to travel. People like that, both from the leisure perspective, like that sense of adventure, and they will continue to do that. That is a human nature, coming back to how humans function. People want to visit friends and family and relatives. People want to go to weddings and dare I say, funerals and pay their respects. That will continue. I mean, obviously, all of that has been shut down. People will want to travel for business. As much as people are enjoying these kind of Zoom calls, I think that they're starting to wear thin on a lot of people.
I think people, as you said, social distancing for 3 months, but today they want to get back to normal. And even if it's a new normal, they want to get back to normal. So, for sure, I agree with you on that one, for sure.
And there's going to be there'll be an adjustment period where it's going to be, I would say, challenging. But the business plan that we built before COVID-19 is for sure going to be modified. There's no doubt about it. They'll have many, many, many repercussions, when you sort of go through the chain, because that might mean that we'll have fewer airplanes. We already mentioned that we're grounding 79 airplanes, which is a massive, massive, massive portion of our fleet. We're going to start building it back up, but have a smaller fleet. We'll have a simplified fleet. That'll have an impact on the aircraft manufacturers. That'll have an impact on the simulator manufacturers. It'll have an impact on seat manufacturers and caterers and leisure resorts and so on. This is how the economy functions. So, when we look at some of these economic outcomes from these events, it has very, very, very far-reaching consequences. And there's no question that I am somewhat, concerned about the overall economic impact the longer that
now I think you're playing at 5% capacity. Is that where you at?
Yeah, we're a little bit more than 5% now. Over the last few weeks, we're seeing demand has improved as far as domestic Canada is involved, but we are still significantly constrained as a result of the various travel restrictions.
So what would you say? There was an article that came out about 2 weeks ago of about 511 infectious disease specialists who, if you looked at what they were saying, they were looking at airline travel now, 12 months from now, a year from now, and I would say that 44% of them were 3 to 12 months. And 37% a year from now, and only 22 were now. So what do you say to them in terms of the safety, where we're going, what we're doing? Because a lot of people are asking those questions.
Right, yeah. So those statistics are I would say not that far from accurate from what we're seeing. So number one, we needed to show, we as Air Canada needed and wanted to be ahead of the rest of the class, just based on our, earlier things that I said, move quickly, be decisive, and communicate, right? So we ended up introducing something that we call Air Canada Clean Care Plus. We intended it as a new protocol that talks about the experience from the beginning to the end, with things that are within our control, right? So that meant, how it is that someone is going to go through the airport, how it is they're going to come to our counters or to our kiosks. And even before we could change the technology, because obviously one of the objectives here will be to have touchless technology as we go forward, but we've introduced a process where there is a cleaning protocol at kiosks, if kiosks are being used. There is a plastic shield at the ticket counter if someone goes to the ticket counter. A mask is obligatory, and we introduced masks as obligatory for our customers before Transport Canada did. A mask is obligatory when you're walking through the airport environment. A mask is obligatory when you board the aircraft. You must wear a mask on the aircraft. Our crew have got masks on the aircraft. Several of our crew have got the visors in addition to the mask. If, for example, they're pushing a wheelchair where they get in very close contact with a customer who is handicapped. We've reduced the product that is served on board. Instead of having the more elaborate food product that we would have had previously, we have these pre-prepared boxes and so on that are delivered, and that it includes everything in one box, and so you don't have the same interaction, the same contact, the same touching. We have temperature checks, when you come in, and again, we introduced that before the Transport Canada did, which they announced it on Friday. We've changed the cleaning protocol using hospital grade disinfectants and static spraying on board the aircraft, which is meant to be picking up 99% of any virus or bacteria. The HEPA filters that are used on board the aircraft are also, again, high grade quality that picks up most of
What's the air circulation like?
Well, that's the point. The air circulation, and with these HEPA filters, this is exactly correct. Yeah. So when you look at all those steps, okay, so does that mean that I'm safe? The answer is it means that you're much safer, because of course you're not eliminating it, you're mitigating it. And this kind of mitigation is something that is, I believe, the new normal for the next period of time, because we will need as a society to find a way to live with this terrible virus until there's a vaccine. And until not only there is a vaccine, but until there is a vaccine that is globally available. So we're not talking about something that is available only in Europe, because that doesn't help us, or even only in North America and Europe, because that doesn't help us, because of course we have people who might be coming from Asia and from Africa and from elsewhere. The world is a connected place, and in order for us to get beyond this current stage, we will need one that is, globally available in massive quantities. Until then, testing, tracing, all of these other initiatives are going to be introduced. In addition to temperature checking, there's folks that are working on an app that monitors the oxygenation rate, which is a big driver of the diagnosis. And then, of course, the blue ribbon consequence will be when you can actually do mass testing and tracing at the airports. So with all this, the point being that it is a much safer exercise. I think people, those 22% that are comfortable to travel, they probably would have been comfortable to travel even without that. But our hope is that we go from 22% to 50%,
right,
over the next little while. Our ambition, and as I've said to many of the government and regulators that I speak to, is not as if we're going to turn on the switch on a given day and that we'll be back to what we were on February the 1st or December 31st, but that it'll be done over a gradual and safe basis.
So some of the airlines that I have seen and some of the pictures I've seen, especially in Europe, is people are still sitting very close together. Everybody's together. There's no middle seat that's taken off. And one of our participants in the audience sent a question ahead of time, and he talked about a French engineer called Florian Barjot and his company called Earthplay, which has developed a new seat-on add-on, it's called Plan Play, that you can put for distance socializing on airlines. So knowing the commercial necessity to have as many people on the plane as possible, but knowing the social distancing on the plane, what is your take on that?
So first of all, what we did, as on an introductory basis until June 30, we said we would keep the middle seat empty in economy class, or if it's a narrow body aircraft on the seat beside. But that basically means that we're selling 50% to 66% of the aircraft maximum. And there's no business case, there's no business case to be made for that. That is not the way, for-profit organizations can function over any period of time. And certainly not one that has the capital cost structure and the employment structure that we have. And the sad reality is, unless somehow, the world was going to, require that and subsidize that, it just wouldn't, you won't have anybody who's operating that. No one should be, no shareholder should be making the investment to invest in that kind of a business. So I don't believe that is going to be the case. I think you will see for some period of time that people are still interested in traveling, even where that is not the case. Airlines will make available distance, where possible, where there is, kind of a adequate availability on that flight. we intend to kind of let people know ahead of time if the flight is booked above a certain level. But it's an impossible business case, so I don't see that going forward. In terms of other product, look, I mean, there've been lots and lots of product that have been thrown at us. We've seen, inverted seats where one is facing forwards, one is facing backwards, somebody putting up a plastic shield between them. These are all things that can be looked at in the fullness of time, although on the assumption that we're looking at a 24-month period before there's a vaccine or thereabouts, it actually might be a sort of a problematic production, even if one was prepared to invest in some of that. So our best bet, in our view, is to have facial coverings, masks, do the things that we're doing to ensure that the aircraft are clean, avoid the unnecessary contact, and allow people to make their decision if they are comfortable to travel in that. Ironically, I was reading about one of the low-cost carriers yesterday that started up, and they were, because they were offering $49 fares or something like that, the flight was full. So I mean, like from a perspective of what some people would be comfortable to do, maybe you wouldn't, maybe I wouldn't, but on that particular flight yesterday, they had $49 fares sold out. So we'll see. But I think that the key is mitigation. See, that's how we have to get that word in our psyche, mitigation. And are you dealing with airlines that are taking this seriously? And people will make their determination based on how airlines are behaving in terms of this risk until the risk is adequately.
And of course, one of the biggest risks are what's being called the quarantine. So I know that the British Airlines are taking really legal action against the government, asking if it's necessary really to quarantine for 14 days. And they say it's overreaction. And this morning, I read an article from an Israeli firm called Pangia that's hoping that they know how they have what's called a biometric card. And a biometric card, basically, they're saying is going to be able to verify, it's like a passport, an immune passport. It's going to be able to verify the health of the person, the immunity of the person, if they have the virus or not. And it's something that they're showing governments and so on and so forth. I don't know if you've heard about it in your comments, because those are issues that I think people are concerned with as well.
Okay, so I think that there are two or three separate interesting questions in that, Monette. First of all, on the whole quarantine issue, this is something that is also, not only is it near and dear to the hearts of the British carriers that have filed that suit, but quite frankly, it's near and dear to my heart as well, because this is the #1 impediment to starting to have some semblance of a return to some level of business, because right now, as we say, we're doing 5%. So how should we think of that? First of all, in Canada, there's not just the quarantine, there are 5 separate layers of travel restriction, if you like. The first one is something that the government of Canada adopted under the Aeronautics Act that actually prevents any foreign nationals from entering the country other than Americans, which we'll talk about in a second. So no foreign nationals are allowed in, period. There are a couple of exceptions, but let's make as a general rule. 2, the US, of course, we have the US-Canada border restrictions. And while I should say, make sure that everyone on the line knows that Canadians can travel to the United States, and we have reinstated flights to the United States, there's no prohibition.
You told me that the other day.
There's no prohibition, even though there's a little bit of a misleading dynamic that exists in the public domain, and I'll tell you if you want where we're flying. But there is a total prohibition coming into Canada at the land border, the sea border, and the air border. So no foreign nationals under the Aeronautics Act. No Americans under the Canada-US border. Then to the extent anyone does come in, like a Canadian that has gone out and comes back in, or any of the first 2 that is under some exception, 14-day quarantine. And so of course, when was the last day that someone went to a business meeting and quarantined for 14 days before starting the business meeting, or went on a 7-day holiday and quarantined for 14 days before starting 7-day? So that is obviously a #1 destroyer of the entire travel dynamic. Fourthly, and this one is very interesting, and bit of a personal pet peeve, one of my personal favorites, is the maritime provinces that have in their wisdom chosen to adopt their own quarantines. So not only do we have a federal quarantine, but we have a provincial quarantine in the provinces of Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick. A total prohibition in those 3 provinces. And in the province of Nova Scotia, a quarantine if someone goes to Nova Scotia. So if you felt like going to visit Anne of Green Gables' house in Prince Edward Island, you would not be permitted. Wow. If you wanted to go into into Nova Scotia and go, sailing around there, you would have to quarantine for 14 days before. So these are special, despite the fact that you are a Canadian, and like our Prime Minister liked to say, a Canadian is meant to be a Canadian is meant to be a Canadian. So these are the four dynamics. And then if to top it all off, on top of that, we have a overall travel advisory, which advises against all travel, not only all non-essential travel, advisory against all travel, which means that people in many cases can't get insurance if they ever have.
Well, I'm in that field, as you know.
Yeah.
And I was shocked about 3 weeks ago, one of my clients was applying for life insurance, never mind travel. And the question was, were they planning to leave Canada before January 2021? And if they were not going to be covered.
Right. Yeah.
So it was really.
No, this is the problem, because it's a travel. So
problem.
those five dynamics together conspire to have demolished completely our business. Now, between, as I say, so what do we do with that? Do we flip the lights on and say, eliminate all of that?
Well, not only that, can I just add that $190 billion of businesses really is the hospitality business. So the airline is linked to the hotels, the resorts, the restaurants, the sporting goods. So all of that comes under what you're talking about.
Exactly. No, and we're actually at the center of it. Airlines are at the drivers.
Exactly.
Travel and tourism business. And so basically, what do we do with that? We can't flick a switch and say that we're going to eliminate all of that, and that's going to be back to the way it was before. Of course not. However, you cannot use the blunt instrument of these kinds of measures on an ongoing basis. We're now 90 plus days into this, so we're now approaching, I think, 100 days. Taking the most extreme example of all, are you trying to tell me that if somebody wanted to come into our country from New Zealand that doesn't have any kind of an issue with this, that would be a risk to Canadians?
You're talking about safe corridors that have started to be
correct. And that's directionally where we think we need to be heading, and so we're advocating quite clearly in that direction. Safe corridors with countries that are that have achieved a certain standing in this, because again, just like the Clean Care Plus thing, we're talking about mitigation. We're not eliminating. We are never going to get to a zero infection rate, right?
No,
we'll never get there. So we're talking about mitigation here, and mitigation is based around taking proper steps. So, our view is
last week of your frustration and of the industry. So that's what you're talking about, right? So the path forward is
corridors. In other words, the EU came up with a very good proposal that just frankly a few days ago on Friday. The EU, with some reservations among some countries there, determined that EU countries can travel freely to other EU countries immediately, and that as of July the 1st, the EU will assess on a 3-point criteria as to whether nationals of other countries can go into the EU. And the three criteria are many of the things we've been talking about here. The three criteria are, I've lost you there for a second. I'm seeing.
No, I'm here. I'm
seeing Rami. Okay.
Yeah, he's gone.
So
because we're coming close to the end and we still have some time left. So Dina, if you'll give us 5 more minutes, because we have a few more things. If people want to stay on the line, that would be great.
Granted.
Okay, go on. Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm talking and talking. I mean, I guess.
No, it's wonderful. People are staying on the line, and I think we could stay on for a long time, Calin. So please go on.
No, I'll just finish this point because I think it is interesting. The question is interesting. So basically, in a nutshell, I think it's a formula similar to what the EU has done, which is kind of the simplest way I can put it, which is to say that you determine which countries are like-minded and have got sort of similar or better track records, that also are taking this whole biosecurity and biohealth thing seriously, like our Clean Care Plus. If that becomes something that Canada takes seriously itself and has a regulatory package around it, and reciprocity. And so that's those will be the 3 drivers, and I would think that that's the path forward, because I think that the amount of damage. So this is one of the things that I think people take for granted. We cannot all stay in our basements and hide from this thing for the next 2 years. It was okay for 3 months, but we cannot stay in our basements and hide from this for the next 2 or 3 years. So, and of course, the catastrophic damage to the economy will be irremediable. So you will not be able to come back from that. And so I think part of it is finding the right balance to live with it, finding the right mitigations, minimizing it as much as we can. We already have learned a lot from it. We know about the hand washing. We know about the coughing in your sleeve. We know about, you know, the repetitive issues around distancing. So these are all drivers that will continue to mitigate this and will make it less of a risk, albeit not eliminated until there's a vaccine.
So I did have another comment on a whole other topic, but because of time, we're going to leave it alone. And it was really about social justice and what was going on in the world today, because both of you and I are passionate about it, but we'll bring you back for another conversation on our social vocation. So I really want to thank you. And before I have Rummy really thank you, there's another sentence from Einstein that I think is appropriate for today. And that is, strive not to be a success, but rather to be of value. And that is what you are. And I really, really appreciate that, Calin. So Rummy, you want to close it up?
Yeah, thank you, Monette. And thank you, Calin, of course. Just would like to thank you for, in this impossible time and everything you have to face, to take the time to talk to us and to spend the time with us. And it's not the first time that we call up on you, and you never say to us no. You always been very accommodating, and truly to say thank you. And just to mention that we all know what you did with Air Canada, and what I call it the maple leaf flying in the sky is maybe one of the strong brand and symbol of Canada. And since you never said no to us, we will never say no to you. And anything you need from us, we'll be here to support you. We'll be here to grant whatever we can to do in order to support you and to support the company you are leading, because Air Canada is part of all of us' life. And we are very proud that somebody like you is leading it. So thank you so much. And we're here for you.
Thank you so much, Rami. That's beautifully said. Really, really beautiful. I'm very touched by what you're saying, and you know that it is hard to say no to you, especially when you bring Monette with you. It's very hard to two of you. It makes it kind of almost impossible. But these are amongst the what you've done with the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, and the special trip that when we went to visit the Einstein archives there, a special moment for me. The association with you, Hebrew University, Monette, and everything that you represent is a privilege and a pleasure for me. So thank you for inviting us. And this is part of my therapy. When Monette asked at the beginning how it is that I what is it that I do to keep in shape? This is the kind of stuff that I do to keep in shape, and I love doing it. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Calin, really. And good luck on everything. And like Rummy said, if we're there to help you, anything we can do. And Norman, thank you.
Pleasure.
Right. Thanks all. Thank you very, very much. Thanks, Norm. Good to see you, and stay well.
Same here. You too, Calin.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.